With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program. As always, we do appreciate any time you're willing to give us and take out of your busy day to spend with us, and we try not to waste your time. In the keeping with that sentiment, we're going to jump straight into the news, straight into our update for today. So we'll go ahead and give you your coronavirus update for the state of Alabama, and we actually have some really interesting data, not so much in the stuff that we normally give you, but we're going to do a state-by-state comparison a little bit later using this data, which will be really interesting. So here is the latest update for today from the Alabama Department of Public Health. You can see there that there are currently 6,499 confirmed cases, 73,997 tested in this state, and the death toll has risen to 222, and then of course 872 hospitalizations across the Yellowhammer State. So there are some interesting data points in this today, but I think that when you're looking at it across the board, the more important and really the more telling data points is when you're looking at it across time. So if you're looking at this graphic that we'll pull up right here, this of course is a chart of all of Alabama's confirmed cases. And so when you're looking at the confirmed cases, you'll notice that this is not a gigantic jump, but it is one that's not insignificant. And so it may be hard to tell, but if you're looking, especially over the course of the past 3-ish days, something like that, you'll notice that they start going up at a rate higher than they have previously. I mean, overall, it's still pretty much a straight line. It hasn't really deviated from being a pretty straight line this entire time. We never really did see that exponential spike that we were talking about. But the reason that, even though this jump is certainly there, the reason that I say it may not really necessarily be a cause for concern is because in a vacuum, this may be a little bit scary, because you would think that we would have roughly plateaued and even started to level off at this point, and we haven't yet. However, the reason that this may actually be the opposite of something as cause for concern is because if you're looking at this relative to our number tested, if you're looking at that rate and understand exactly how that works, we've actually gone down significantly. Because if you're looking at the number of people we're testing versus the number of people that actually are confirmed cases, that's actually gone down to 8.78% of people that are tested in the state of Alabama being positive for the novel Wuhan coronavirus. That's significant because if you may remember, we've been tracking these numbers for a while, and one of the very first things that we looked at, one of the first statistics that we noticed, is that it started out pretty high, about 15%, and then occasionally it would wade down into being like 11-ish%, something like that, which was pretty much on par with national averages. If you're looking at this, 7.78%, that is the lowest that I can ever remember it being. I can't definitively say it is the lowest because I haven't checked that rate every single day, but this is the lowest it's been so far as I can recall. Having a number this low is certainly something that is in our favor. It means that the virus is starting to lose hold, and this comes at a time where we are exponentially increasing our testing. There's actually quite a bit of new testing now. In that same sort of line of thinking, here is a graph of new coronavirus cases per day. And you'll notice that over the past several days, we've seen a really interesting pattern. We had virtually none whatsoever on Friday, and then a big jump on Saturday and Sunday. Not the biggest we've ever seen, but a not insignificant jump. and then really not that many today. But the important point to understand in all of this and to be able to look at it and tell is that if you're looking at it on the whole, we're having a couple of bad days surrounded by a couple of really good days when it comes to new cases. And the fact that it's bookended like that, I think, sort of makes it look as though it's bigger than it is. If you were to average those levels off, it would be very different. So if you're looking at the average over the past 4 days, that new average is going to be about 232 per day. If you're looking at the 4 days prior to that, in other words, the 4 days before this 4-day period, the average was 190 per day. So we still have had an increase, and that increase should not be discounted or just glossed over. But what I'm saying is the increase isn't nearly as drastic as the graph may appear that it is, because we had those 2 days where we had very few new cases. And so there is a big difference there. It is something that we should be made aware of. Now, there are far more, this phenomenon is far more likely due to the spike in testing than it was an increase in sick people. So we are seeing more cases, but we're also seeing more cases at a time where we're testing more. And so this is actually a really good thing that we're seeing an increase in cases, because if the cases correlates directly to the increase in testing, well, then that's actually really good news, because that means more people are sick. We're finding out which ones are sick at a higher rate, and it's not because more people are actually getting sick, probably. It's more likely that the increase in testing is the reason for that. And the reason that I bring that up is if you look at this test, or if you look at this graph that measures testing, the number of new tests per day, you can see that the same 2 days that we had that exponential spike in coronavirus cases, we have a very similar exponential spike in coronavirus testing. This is not an insignificant or unlinked thing. And so the fact that the new tests seem to coincide with the new cases is actually pretty good news for us. And it's also good news that our increase in testing is significantly more than our increase in in cases, because you'll notice the past 2 days were both brand new records for the number of testing we did in a single day. And that's compared to the number of new cases, which was significant, but they were only in the top 5 or 6 when it comes to the number of new coronavirus cases that we've tested positive for in a single day. And if you're looking at that graph, that's roughly triple what the average is. So there have been other days where we had big increases in testing. Usually it followed a day where we didn't have any new testing or very little new testing, and so it was probably that the numbers were catching up. That doesn't seem to be the case in this particular situation. And the fact that those 2 days back to back, and not just 1 day, but 2 days where we tripled the average, that really speaks volumes to how much our testing has increased in the state. It is a really good thing, a really good look for the state of Alabama that this is taking place. Now, I have one more graph that I want to show you, and unfortunately, despite all of that really good news that we just had, there is a little bit of bad news that goes with that, because our death rate has increased a little bit as well, and we're going to talk about that and exactly what that means. These are new coronavirus deaths, so in other words, just testing the new deaths that we have per day. And you will notice there that the new deaths had gone down and then started spiking back up. So we're significantly less than we were, a week ago. But that's still not an insignificant number. And so we are going down, but we are seeing an increase over the past week. And that really can't be chalked up to testing, because people would be dying and we would be finding out whether or not those people had the coronavirus or not once they passed, pretty much regardless of whether or not we were testing a lot or not. And so based on the death rate, it's showing that we are at a decreasing trajectory. And if we wind up having no coronavirus deaths like we did on Friday, and that's a trend that continues, that could be good. But here's the reason that I am kind of worried about this, and I don't think that the fact that we've had such a dramatic decrease is necessarily something that we should sort of wipe our brow and go, we're in the clear. I want you to notice the past few days. And then I want you to look other places on the chart and notice where there are other similar lulls that lasted for a few days. Do you notice that they're all weekends? That if you're looking at, for example, the 19th and the 20th, or the 9th and the 10th, that these lulls that are taking, or not the 9th and the 10th, sorry, the 11th and the 12th and the 13th, you're noticing that all these lulls that you're seeing in the death rate, and by the way, this coincides with national data, for some reason they coincide with weekends. Now, granted, that's really strange, and as I've said before, I don't really understand exactly how or why the death rate drops so dramatically on the weekends, but according to national averages, that is a phenomenon that is going on across the country, that typically, if you're getting the coronavirus and you die, you're not dying on Saturday and Sunday for some reason. And in Alabama, and this is partly because this is a lagging statistic, it's getting less to be less of a lagging statistic, but still a lagging statistic that tends to extend into Monday as well. But here what we're seeing is, if this becomes the new low point, in other words, if the new weekend numbers tend to be what we're seeing roughly around the 11 mark, then I'm afraid what's going to happen is that once the week gets rolling, we're going to see deaths in the 40s or 50s. Now, I could be wrong, and Lord knows that I hope I'm wrong, but if the trends that we've been seeing so far continue on, then that means if we're having 11 or 12 deaths on a weekend, then we're going to have significantly more than that on the weekday, which will be an increase that we've not seen so far since we've been tracking this thing. I hope I'm wrong on that. I really do pray that I am, but that would be what the indication and the trend seems to be suggesting, because we've gone whole weekends without a single coronavirus death, and now we're having 11 on back-to-back days. That's not a good sign. So, mostly good news. The death rate, not necessarily bad news looking at it in a vacuum, but with proper context and understanding the way the trends go, it could be bad news. We'll just have to wait a couple days and see if it actually is bad news or not. That's really where we are. And another thing that is bad news is we've also been tracing the statistic that shows your lethality rate, in other words, the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 versus how many people have died from it. Well, if you're looking at that in the Yellowhammer State, that rate comes out right now to be 3.4%. So definitely not a good place to be, especially when you consider our death rate at one point was about 1.6, 1.8, sort of hovering around that neighborhood. And now the fact that we're at 3.4, that's not good for Alabama's lethality rates. And again, that's the death rate is really something you can't chalk up to an increase in testing. Now, there are other reasons to believe that the lethality rate probably isn't, the realistic lethality rate isn't anywhere close to 3.4, even if you're looking at that ratio by our statistics. There have been 2 new studies, granted they're preliminary because this thing is all happening basically in real time and we're trying to scramble to get a hold of whatever data we can. But there have been a couple of new studies done both in Los Angeles and in New York, and they're doing antibody testing, which is essentially trying to see how many people may have been asymptomatic. They test for the antibodies that are created by the body when you contract this virus. And if you were asymptomatic, then you would have the antibodies in your system. And if that is the case, then that means there could be an awful lot of people that had this virus that we just didn't realize had it, which of course would be a very, very good thing. And the latest data, the latest numbers that are coming out of LA and are coming out of New York as well, suggest that that actually is in fact what is going on. In fact, the most recent numbers show that as much as 50% more than the people that we originally believed had this virus actually do have it. And if that's the case, that's really good. That's very beneficial for us because that means that lethality rate is going to take a, pun intended, a shot in the arm, and it's going to actually go down significantly once we know that those people do in fact have this virus. And if that's the case in New York and LA, there's really no reason to believe that we wouldn't see at least similar results in other places as well. So maybe that's the case. We just don't know. So even if that's the case, though, it seems as though Alabama's death rate is a little bit higher than the national average. So, or it seems that way on the surface. It's actually not, and we're going to go over those numbers in a second. But the question is, why are we seeing deaths at this level right now? Well, there's a couple of different environmental factors that may be playing into this. For example, Alabama, as we went over when this thing started, sort of preparing you for what's to come. Alabama does have a older population when compared to most states. We're not way older. We're not nowhere near Florida, for example, but we're a older state. There are older people. The average age is bigger than it is in other states. And another thing that makes a significant difference is that we do have high rates of things like obesity and diabetes and people who are past smokers. Remember, this is a respiratory disease. And so because of that, these factors are playing into how deadly this virus is in the state of Alabama. Those demographic changes do make a difference, but there is a good chance that that's really the only thing that's making a difference, because based on what we're seeing, it is not because Alabama is ill-prepared. In fact, if you're looking at hospitals and UAB and some of our other hospitals, even the small rural ones, if you're looking at them and understanding exactly how many resources they have and whether or not they're overtaxed, this has not been a lack of preparing on Alabama's part, because there have not been patients that have been denied care because they didn't have proper equipment or were unable to perform the procedure because of an overflow. That has not happened in the state of Alabama or in the United States of America, which is it's a testament to how well America has handled this crisis and handled epidemics in general, that when this thing hits, that we're able to do so, which other countries can't say. Not a single person that is a COVID-19 patient that has wanted or has needed some kind of medical procedure or medical equipment has not been able to get it, unlike other countries. And so, with that being said, that's really not Alabama's problem. And so the only thing that it seems to make sense that you can chalk up our death rate to would be environmental factors. But the thing is, if you're looking at us compared to other states, that's not necessarily something that we are getting to be that is really a big problem with us. So I was looking at some of the numbers compared to other states. And Alabama has 46 deaths per 1 million, which places us when you're looking at death rates, and this, of course, is adjusted for population, so because it wouldn't make sense to compare us to Texas or California, for example, nor would it make sense to compare us to New Hampshire. We're a mid-sized state. And so if you're comparing our population to other populations and adjusting for that difference, that puts us at 46 deaths per 1 million, which means we are 28th in the country. So we're definitely not doing as well as, for example, Hawaii, which also has a number of other strategic advantages in fighting this virus for obvious reasons. But when you're looking at our death rate and looking at how many deaths we're having compared to other places in the country, 28th is in the lower half. It's close to half, but not quite above half. So we're actually below average when it comes to death rates compared to other states. And so it seems as though this is not in any way a political thing. It's not as though Alabama was ill-prepared or our healthcare system wasn't equipped to handle it or people were being denied care because of that. It seems as though it really is demographic issues that are coming into play here. And to compare to other states that have similar demographics, Florida, Mississippi, and Georgia all have higher rates. Tennessee has slightly lower rates. Now, to say that we're neck and neck is a little too generous, but the thing is, none of the states are wildly out of step except for New York and New Jersey. So comparing the other 48 states, neck and neck isn't really fair to say, but it's hard to really come up with any kind of distinguishing pattern that separates the 48 states from the other states, with the exception, like I said, of New York and New Jersey. And so we're doing better than our neighbors, Florida, Mississippi, and Georgia when it comes to death rates, but Tennessee's death rate is slightly lower than ours. So if you're comparing also just cases, confirmed cases as a whole, as opposed to just deaths, we also have 1,336 per 1 million, which places us, again, at 28th. And compared to our neighbors, we're doing about the same. And so that really does show that Alabama is really not in a bad position when you consider how all of this is played out and where we are. So, based on the numbers, it's hard to really look at this and say that Alabama is in a bad way or in a good way. It's more like we're doing roughly the same as everybody else, including those directly to the north, south, east, and west of us. Now, you may have heard that Governor Ivey has already announced that she is going to make an announcement. I know she announced her announcement. I find that a little bit humorous. But Governor Ivey has announced that she will make an announcement tomorrow on reopening the state. Now, that announcement could be that she's not going to reopen the state. I tend to think that it may be that she is planning to reopen the state, but do so gradually. Here's the thing about Governor Ivey. Governor Ivey, the most effective way, I'll put it that way, the most effective way to predict what Governor Ivey is going to do is, how can I stay out of trouble? The reason that she has been successful in politics for as long as she has is because she basically abides by that one political rule. Whatever I can do that is not going to make waves, is not going to cause a controversy, is not going to stir up everything. And I'm saying this within the state of Alabama. I get that some of the things Governor Ivey has done are viewed very controversially outside the state, but specifically inside the state of Alabama, the only way to really predict what Governor Ivey is going to do is to figure out what is going to make her as uncontroversial as possible. We even saw this in her campaign, that basically Governor Ivey's true north, the thing that guides her through her political career, is, let me make sure I do everything I can to not rock the boat. And that's been pretty consistent. And so that's one of the reasons that on these things, Governor Ivey tends to take her time a little bit more, which isn't necessarily a bad quality. I know that I've been very critical of Governor Ivey in the past, and I'm going to be a little bit critical of her right now, but that is not a necessarily horrible policy. I'm just saying that this is a pretty good indication of what Governor Ivey is going to do. I think that she's going to announce at least a plan to reopen, if it's not immediate reopening. Even the national projections have Alabama very high on the list of states that can open pretty early, putting it as close as May 4th. So I would guess something along the lines of she's going to do a soft open roughly around, Monday. And the thing is, with other governors that are talking about opening up their states, it's important to understand that doesn't mean they go back to business as normal or business as the way that it was before this virus hit. That's simply not happening. What is going on, whether you're talking about Governor Kemp in Georgia or Governor Abbott in Texas, or if you're looking at all of the different governors that are talking about doing this reopen, they are talking about opening certain businesses. They're leaving some closed, and there are stipulations on how those businesses are to open. I got to say, based on the most recent data and the things that we saw from President Trump's task force the other day, talking about some of the studies that they've done about how this thing does not survive well in sunlight, I think that the smartest thing to do would be to open up, or at least do a limited open up of just about every business in the state, as long as they can figure out some way to operate in the sunshine. So, for example, if you are a barber, what I would do is I would say, come by, get your hair cut, and I'm going to move my chair out in the parking lot. I mean, that might be the smartest thing to do. If you're running a restaurant, maybe section off a section of your parking lot and set up some tables and chairs there. And of course, have them a decent, distance apart. If you have an outdoor venue where you can actually just roll back the roof, or you already have a place outside like a patio to be able to operate that way, that would be how I would operate my business if I were in that specific situation. And that's going to make things a lot safer, because even if somebody gets up and leaves that table and they wait, I don't know, based on the numbers that we saw, just 2 minutes, you're in the clear. You don't even have to go and sanitize that table. I mean, you should, but you don't even have to go and actually sanitize that table. The sunlight will do it for you. And so if that is the case, it seems to me, based on our new information, an open up is something that is not only necessary because people really need to get back to work and we need to start opening this thing back up really soon because of the economic damage that has already been done. But even looking aside, not even taking into account the economic need to do it, based on the science, this just makes sense. Because we know more about the virus now. We're a lot better equipped to handle the virus if something happens and we start letting people out and infection rates do go through the roof. I mean, God forbid that would happen, but if it does happen, we are significantly better equipped to handle it. And we know a lot more about the virus, and based on what we've heard recently, Alabama's about to get some pretty hot and humid weather, as we always do. And that's going to go a long way in curtailing any progress this virus could make and any lasting damage it could do. And so at least having a plan in place to start opening up, that makes sense at this point. And so when it comes to Governor Ivey and all of this, here's my final point, and this is really the overriding principle that I would suggest, and this is the reason that I opposed Governor Ivey issuing stay-at-home orders and shutdown orders in the first place. Freedom is the answer. When you give the American people or the people of Alabama the liberty to do what they want and open it up and leave it to them, because in this country, the individual, that's always the first level. That's where the rights start, the individual. And then it goes to the local, then it goes to the state, then it goes to the federal. That's how our federalist system works. The individual is the first line of defense, and should be. Those individuals are going to make decisions that benefit them. They're going to act, by and large, of course there's going to be some exceptions, by and large they're going to act in their own best interest. If you are a person like me who has risk factors, I have 2 of them, I'm probably going to stay in a little bit longer until I have a better sense that it's safe. Somebody else that's young and healthy and never been sick a day in their life, and they know that the mortality rate is going to be significantly less than even 1% if they get it, even if they get a bad case of it, well, then it makes sense for that person to not go out and be reckless. They still need to take precautions, but to be able to go out and to a great degree operate the way that they normally did, that's something that makes sense for them. In other words, leaving those decisions upon the individual instead of the government gives us more liberty and means that the people that are more at risk are going to tend to be the ones that decide on their own to stay at home. That's what's going on here. The individual leads the government, not the other way around. That's how our country is designed. And furthermore, there are very serious questions about whether or not the stay-at-home orders or stay-at-home procedures make any difference anyway. There was a report that came out today by T.J. Rogers at the Wallstreet Journal, and the headline is, "Do lockdowns save many lives? In most places, the data say no. The speed with which officials shuttered the economy appears to not be a factor in COVID deaths." So I'm going to go through this, and most of this is a paraphrase. But in this study, he controlled for the population and the time by only starting out at each state at which they hit 1 per 1 million deaths for a fixed 21-day period. So in other words, to try to eliminate all kinds of factors, in other words, when the virus arrived, he waited until the epidemic hit a certain point in the state, and then started there, measured for 21 days, and then cut it off. So that way we're dealing with an even amount of time. We're dealing with each individual state at essentially this point and how they're dealing with the virus, the peak at which they're dealing with the virus, the critical moment, and seeing if that made a significant difference in the amount of deaths or not. For example, if you had 3 deaths per 1 million in Iowa, that's when you would have started in Iowa. If you had 19 deaths per 1 million in New York, that's when you started in New York. New York has a larger population, so that way he was controlling both for population and was controlling for the time at which they were dealing with this. So it's actually a very clever way to handle this. So then they ran a correlation of that point, the day where they started out on 1 per 1 million, versus how many days the shutdown would start. So this ranged from -10 to 35 days. In other words, there were some states that started as far back as 10 days before they hit 1 per 1 million. There were other states that didn't start until 35 days or even later. Some states like South Dakota, for example, never really initiated a shutdown like other states did. They put some measures in place, but they never did a full-on shutdown like Alabama or other states did. And so they ran this correlation, and they found a correlation coefficient was 5.5%, which, by the way, is significantly lower, not just lower, significantly lower than you would have to show to find some kind of correlation. In other words, didn't really matter how early the states put the shutdown orders in place, whether it was a state that put the shutdown orders in place very early or waited until, 35-ish days after they hit that point, or never actually put it into place. Didn't matter. Didn't matter because there was no correlation between the amount of deaths that they had and other factors, which if you were doing this in a scientific study of trying to trace a disease, or if you were an engineer or something like that, you would look at that and say there was no correlation. It was not significant enough to really show up on the graph, as it were, and you would start looking for other correlations to determine what the cause was, which means that the shutdown orders, at least based on this data and based on the study, not a factor. Not at all. There are other factors that make a big difference. I mean, there's a reason that New York City was in a full-on panic mode, although not nearly as bad as they originally projected it would be. But there's a reason that this thing really hammered New York City and didn't hammer, for example, LA. These cities are very similar in a lot of ways, with the exception of two major factors. One, LA doesn't have a subway system, or at least not one to the significant degree that New York does. And two, LA is a lot more spread out than New York. In New York, people are stacked on top of each other. You're constantly coming in contact with other human beings all the time. That's just the way that New York City is. You're all crammed in together. It's one of the most densely populated cities. Well, it is the most densely populated city on U.S. soil. And so because of that, and because of the difference, you're seeing a very different reaction from New York and LA. This wasn't because of a shutdown. This was because of other environmental factors that play a role in how bad the virus got, depending on where you were. Now, in Sweden, because we're going to compare other places, because we've already looked at some of the states, Sweden, which did not do a full shutdown, they put some measures in place, and they told people that were sickly, look, if you're sick, if you've got some risk factors, stay at home, but otherwise just go to work, go about your normal business, wear a mask, sanitize your hands, but other than that, pretty much go back to business as normal. Sweden never really did that full shutdown, and yet, looking at this same study, comparatively, Sweden has a lower death rate than the 7 states that were hit hardest by the coronavirus in that same time period: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Louisiana, Connecticut, Michigan, New Jersey, and New York. And of those 7 states that were hit the hardest, every single state, except for Louisiana, shut down in 3 days or less than the time period they're talking about. In other words, when they hit that 1 per 1 million death rate. So in other words, didn't make a difference. Whether or not you shut down did not save any lives. Even if you basically stayed unshut down, like South Dakota or Sweden, still didn't make a difference. And so it just really is astounding that even though we've made such a big deal about the shutdowns, and I remember in Alabama, people were actually angry and threatening Governor Ivey for not shutting it down and saying that she doesn't care about people and doesn't care about their safety and all those things. And yet, people that didn't do a shutdown at all, they fared about the same as people that shut down even before they hit that marker that you're seeing here. Also, if you're comparing other European nations, Sweden also fared better than Italy, Spain, and the UK, which did initiate shutdowns. Another big thing to consider, America's COVID-19 death rate is the 3rd best and roughly the same as Germany. Or sorry, did I say Alabama? I'm in America. America's COVID-19 death rate is the 3rd best in the world and roughly the same as Germany if you remove New York City. So New York City, of course, like I said, it's an outlier because of the way that it's designed. It's incredibly densely populated. But if you were to take New York City, just New York City, not New York State, New York City out of the equation, America is doing just as well as Germany is. Now, I'm not saying that you just don't count New York City, because of course New York City is a part of the United States, and I mean, it should count. I'm just saying that if you consider that we're third best, and frankly, I think Turkey's lying. There's no reason to believe that Turkey's government is really handling this as well as they're saying. They're fudging the numbers just like China is. I'm convinced of that. Maybe we'll find out later that they weren't, but I find that hard to buy. But right now, it looks as though America is doing better than every European country except for Germany and Turkey. And again, I would say that probably just Germany. And if you were to take New York out of the equation, then actually America would be doing about the same as Germany. So America has handled this thing exceptionally well. And I do think that you really, looking at that, it really does add some perspective. So there was another big local story that we're going to cover real quickly, because this is devastating to learn. UAB is losing $70 million a month due to these restrictions. And, losing that amount of money because of the shutdown, because they're not allowed to do elective surgeries. They're not allowed to basically do anything that isn't either an absolute emergency. In other words, this person will die if he doesn't get immediate medical treatment, or something dealing with this pandemic. This is the reason that I said it was ridiculous to shut this down. I found it hilarious, too, that a lot of my pro-abortion friends were all in favor of the shutdown and all in favor of shutting down all non-elective procedures except for abortion, which is really odd. But they were all in favor of that, and yet they constantly chant, well, how can you get between a person and their doctor when it comes to their medical decisions? Like, well, this is like the biggest example of that in American history, is the government just flat out saying, nope, you can't do any of those elective surgeries. You can't do any exploratory stuff. You can't, nothing. Anything that is not life-threatening right now, you and your doctor are not allowed to make that decision on your own. And this shutdown has really hurt the medical community. Now, granted, UAB did get $30 million in relief from the federal government, but if they're losing $70 million a month and they've already been shut down for a little over a month now, it doesn't take a mathematician to realize that's a massive loss for them. And so, operating at a loss, they won't be able to do that for much longer. And normally they operate at roughly 92-ish% capacity. In other words, about 92% of the patients that they can treat, they do treat. That's usually about where they operate. And right now, they are currently at 60. So you can understand why they're losing so much money, because they're not allowed to take patients that they normally would. And the idea that the government can make a better decision on what is essential or non-essential, when it comes to medicine especially, that's just ridiculous. I mean, that logic also holds with things like jobs and products that you would need, whatever else that you would talk about, but especially when it comes to medicine, the fact that the government can dictate down to to medical professionals and citizens, no, you don't need that, so you can't get it. Well, one thing that you need to keep in mind too, and I can say this from experience, I would not have known that I had cancer if I had if I had started to get to the point where I needed to go to the doctor, about the time that this whole thing started. I would have just sat around with cancer in my body for a month to a month and a half longer without ever going to the doctor, because them checking me out was non-essential. And so the real question is, how many lives has this shutdown cost us because of things like that? Now, I probably wouldn't have died, although I was stage 3, so, who knows? Thank God that they did catch it when they did. But my point is, there are cases like that where we're having government officials say that you can't get this government procedure might actually result in deaths that could have been avoided if they had just left that decision up to the hospitals. The hospitals are not intentionally going to take on a whole bunch of frivolous elective surgeries at the time that they feel as though they need to preserve their resources for an epidemic. The hospitals are smart enough to know to prepare for that kind of thing. They don't need the government to come in and tell them what they can and can't do. That again goes back to what I was saying earlier with Governor Ivey about the shutdown. Freedom is the answer. Let people decide. Don't make the government the one who has to decide that. And typically, UAB also performs about 150 surgeries a day. Now they're down to under 60, which again shows you the kind of level that these elective surgeries, as they call them, are being done and how much money that brings into the hospital. And another thing, how much people are just not going to the hospital. This is another thing that's been reported because they're afraid that they're going to get sick. They're afraid that if they go to the hospital, they're going to contract this virus and make whatever they have worse. So it's a combination, really, of those two things. Part of it is that they're not doing what would be considered elective surgeries that they need to go ahead and do. But another one that is being neglected or really not thought about is the amount of people that would normally go to the doctor to schedule a surgery like this that aren't going because they're afraid of that. And so it's a combination, really, of those two factors. I think what this all comes down to, I understand that nobody wants to believe that they're wrong. Nobody wants to admit that they're wrong. I understand that. And if you're the person that pulled the trigger and went ahead and scheduled a shutdown, and you have to admit that maybe it wasn't really as effective as we thought it was going to be, I get why that's a very hard thing to come back to people and say, look, guys, I made the wrong call. I don't really think Governor Ivey has to do that at this point. She can just play it off as though, which I mean, this isn't a lie. This is not even really spin. It is true. Look, we've got new information. We're better equipped to handle this thing now. We can go ahead and open up the state. That's not an incorrect statement. Politically, that would be something that is feasible. But the thing is, I think the reason people are afraid to even do that is because they don't want to admit that they were wrong. But the thing is, being wrong is nothing to be embarrassed about, especially in a situation like this where the information simply was not available. I mean, to a great degree, of course, my default, like I said, is always to err on the side of liberty. And so I would have made the decision, if I were in that position, look, just let the people decide. We're not going to step in. They can make their own decisions. But even that aside, when it comes down to it, you can look at this and see a situation that is in many ways unprecedented. I wouldn't say totally unprecedented, but in many ways unprecedented. You can look at that and say, you know what? I was wrong, and the reason I was wrong is because I didn't have all the information. In a lot of government decisions, that's not the case. The information was available. People knew about certain things ahead of time. For example, there's no reason that the Obama administration had an excuse for saying, oh, we just didn't know that it was going to increase premiums, when they absolutely did. We know that for a fact now. When it comes to this, you really couldn't have known. You couldn't have known that the shutdown, how effective it was going to be. We didn't have a treatment for the thing. In other countries, these kinds of shutdowns did not happen, and we were seeing all kinds of mass chaos in a worldwide pandemic. It's understandable that people got scared and made the wrong call. And I say all that to say there's nothing to be embarrassed about getting new information and changing your mind. That's what's supposed to happen when you get new information. But I think a lot of the people are sort of stubbornly clinging to the conclusion that they reached earlier because they don't want to admit that they made the wrong call. There have been several things. If you just went back and watched all of my episodes from the beginning of this coronavirus pandemic, I've been wrong a lot. I'm okay with saying that because I was operating off of the information that I had at the time. And maybe there were times where I could have made a better decision or a better prediction on how to cover something, even without the advantage of hindsight. But the point is, I'm doing the best that I can, and I give other people the benefit of the doubt, thinking that they're doing the best that they can. I think that Governor Ivey's decision was wrong. I said it at the time. I'm saying it now. But the point is, it makes more sense to admit that you're wrong, reverse course, and fix it if you have good reason to believe that you were incorrect in the past. Holding on to your original conclusion, especially one that you reached having less information than you do now, that doesn't make any sense and it doesn't help anybody. Governor Ivey, open up the state. It's time. With the information that we have now, with the severe questions about whether or not shutdowns even have an effect, and the damage that it's doing to our economy and our state, there is no question it's up to you to open this thing back up. Take some precautions. Make sure that we're not all going, slamming the accelerator the second that we get out of the gate. I don't think that that's wise either. I think, sort of slowly emerging. And again, that'll just happen naturally. I think the people of Alabama are going to do that anyway, regardless of what the government orders do. You could just rescind the whole thing tomorrow, and I don't think it would make a difference in how we do gradually start getting back to work. But based on everything that we know now, that just makes sense at this point. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a minute on Tactics.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
All right, here we are. So you guys remember last year, one of the things I talked about in a segment called Straw Wars is how the liberals, despite no scientific evidence or backing whatsoever, believe that somehow they are saving the sea life by banning plastic straws. In response to this, Mellow Mushroom has started giving out paper straws as opposed to plastic straws. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how effective the paper straws are with the most difficult drink to drink, a milkshake. Let's see how this stands up. All right, so first of all, I got about 2 sips out of that, and the paper stuck to my lips. This thing does not work too well. Boy, it'd take you 2 hours to drink this with this.
Well, see, I'm using plastic.
That's John from Millbrook, by the way. He's
Now,
the one driving.
I think they use plastic because that's the best thing to use.
This thing sucks. Well, actually, it doesn't suck. If it sucked, I'd be fine with it, but it doesn't. This milkshake will melt before I finish this. All right. Experiment over. It's biodegradable. All right. We're going to fix this now. There we go. Good old petroleum-based plastic straws. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Oh, that's so much better.
I got a question about this.
Oh yeah?
With the paper, aren't they concerned about the trees, having to cut down the trees to make the straws too? Is that not a...
Well, that's one of the points that I made. It doesn't matter what you make the straw out of. You're expending some kind of resource.
Well, yeah, because we all live here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, it doesn't matter what you make any product out of. You're expending some kind of resource. Mm-hmm. And that's true of straws or anything else. Well, I tell you this. Just based on this little experiment, I know that I saw that Disney is planning to go completely paper straw by 2020 on all their cruise lines and all of their amusement parks. I contend that Disney World is not the happiest place on earth if I can't drink a Dead Blame milkshake while I'm there.
But I will, to their defense, say one thing.
Oh?
You can take a pocket knife in. So help me.
That's something.
Yeah.
Anyway, alright, so even though this went about the way I expected it to, paper straw experiment failed miserably. I imagine if I had left it in there much longer, it would have dissolved. I had a buddy the other day that went to a place that used paper straws. He said he had to order 6 different straws throughout the course of his meal because they kept dissolving on him. Which I'm sitting there thinking, you can't tell me that using 1 plastic straw is worse for the environment than 6 paper straws. I mean, that's just common sense. Anyway, alright, thanks guys. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my milkshake.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And for today's Daily Dose of Stupid. Now, in this particular situation, I don't have one specific person because I think there's dumb on all sides. And I am talking about a story that a lot of people have had a lot to say about, and virtually none of it productive. And by the way, I'm including political types on the right and the left. I'm not trying to make it strictly a partisan thing, but it was a stupid moment that the stupid got contagious, and everybody basically caught stupid around it. So the story that this all originated with was the nation essentially fighting over whether or not Trump was suggesting that people inject disinfectant into themselves or not to try to combat the novel Wuhan coronavirus. Here's the thing. Yes, that clip, I'm not even going to play it because I know you've seen it 1,000 times at this point. I get it. Go watch the clip in its entirety, watch it in its full context, and especially watch what happened directly before that when he had the guy from his task force speaking ahead of time about the new information, because that information was actually pretty good, and it got quickly overshadowed by the goofy comment that the president made. So, yes, the comment was goofy, it was clunky, it was a word salad, and it was hard to tell exactly what he was talking about. All of those things are true. What is also true is that the media and people on the left tried to make a big deal about it when it really wasn't. So, yes, it was not worded very carefully. I think that that's really safe to say regardless of who you are. But at the same time, I don't think that any honest person that believes Trump has an IQ, even in the double digits, would think what he is suggesting is that somebody hook up a bleach to their IV and just, strain it in there. That's not what he was talking about. Nobody that was even somewhat honest or wanted to use even basic human logic believed that that's what Trump was actually saying. He said something goofy and weird and it didn't really make a lot of sense, but it wasn't that. And that's the main thing that I want to get at, is that this is a pretty good way for the Democrats to take a pot shot at Trump, but a pot shot is all it should have amounted to. There were people that were trying to use this as evidence that he is unfit for office, that he's just a moron, that he's trying to kill people, or they're making all these cases that just make a mountain out of a molehill. Here's the best way to explain what was actually going on in that segment. In that little piece of news that you were watching in that news conference, or that press conference, the best way to understand what was actually going on there is to understand that the president's brain operates pretty much like Google Talk to Text. And by the way, I'm not making fun of the president because the guy's not a doctor, he's not a scientist, and we shouldn't expect him to be. Now, if Dr. Ben Carson were up there, said exactly the same thing, okay, I'm going to be a little harsher on him because he's a doctor. He's supposed to know this stuff. President Trump, not so much. And so I give him a little bit of leeway in the same way that I would give similar leeway to President Cruz if he were there. Very smart man, argued in front of the Supreme Court 9 times and won every single case, still not a doctor, not really his area of expertise. And so this isn't an intelligence thing, if you ask me. But the president's brain basically operates like Google Talk to Text. You say something into the phone, and it comes out, and you can kind of tell that some of the stuff that you said and some of the stuff that you put into it, that they remain there, and you can kind of tell what you were trying to say in most circumstances, but it's definitely garbled. That's how the president's brain works. It goes in normal, and then it comes out not really damaged, and you can kind of see where he was going with it, but it's definitely some stuff was lost in translation. And so I think that that is the most fair-minded way to observe this whole little episode that happened. But the problem is, anybody in front of the camera that much is going to say things that make them look goofy or unintelligent. President Obama did it, granted not very often. He was a very eloquent speaker, usually well put together, but there were moments that President Obama was in front of a camera and screwed up and it looked like he was lost, or he took in some information and didn't really quite understand it or didn't quite get it, and something similar to this happened. President Trump has been on TV and in front of a camera a exorbitant amount, even compared to the way that he normally is, or any other president normally is, over the past several weeks. And so if you keep anybody in front of a camera that often, just like any other human being, they're going to say or do something dumb or goofy. And that's what happened here. I'm not excusing it. I'm not saying that it was a good moment for President Trump. It just wasn't the earth-shattering event that the media and people on the left are trying to make it into. So, first of all, let me go ahead and give you, because the sort of the thing that this is all based on is that, it's just crazy that anybody would even consider putting disinfectant into the body. That's just insane. Oh, well, let's look at the definition of the word disinfectant. So this is coming from Merriam-Webster. Disinfectant, an agent that frees from infection. Huh. Well, by that definition, and that is the literal denotation of that word, technically antibiotics are disinfectants, which can be taken inside the body in pill form or through injection and used to essentially free the body of infections. That's what antibiotics do. Now, I don't know that that was necessarily what President Trump was thinking, but I'm tired of people, because they want to dunk on the president or really any other political adversary. I would do the same thing if the roles were reversed, trying to say that, that's just such a crazy foreign concept. No, I don't think that's what the president actually meant when he said disinfectant. I don't think that he was thinking Lysol or Clorox. That was not a thing that was going through his mind. But the idea that there could be a medical procedure where you would, inject some kind of medically safe disinfectant into your lungs in order to free yourself from the virus, it's kind of weird and out there. It's definitely thinking outside the box, but it's not necessarily something that we're close to or have even thought of as being a treatment, so probably not the wisest thing for Trump to do, and this is part of the problem with Trump and his personality in general. The guy thinks out loud, always has, and it's annoying as all get out, and not a good idea. But that's who President Trump is. He doesn't wait and filter things before he says them. Basically, whatever's going on in his head just comes out his mouth, which is part of the reason that he's known for saying these things that don't really make sense or that are not a fully formed thought. I wouldn't say most people don't do that, but there's a plurality of people that they don't think out loud, or at least not usually. But President Trump, it seems like everything that's going on in his head immediately comes out of his mouth, and that's one of the reasons that he tends to find himself in these situations. The president really is his own worst enemy. But here's where I think President Trump really screwed up. Because he could have just wrote it off or just played it off as just being, oh yeah, but that wasn't really what I was trying to say. I was looking for a different word or something like that. It's something else that would have gotten rid of the germs. That would have been the better way to handle it. There were also people that were talking about, he was talking about injecting UV light into the body. I don't think so. That doesn't seem to be, based on the context, what he was talking about. I think he was talking about some kind of drug or chemical agent that would basically sanitize the inside of the lungs, based on what I heard. Could be wrong. But that seems to be what was going on. But President Trump did, I think, what is not the worst offense, but definitely not one of the better ones. He said that basically it was just sarcasm. I was being sarcastic. That's what was happening. That's what Trump does. No, I don't buy into the fact that that was sarcasm. It really did seem like he was trying to form a thought there live on stage, and it just wasn't coming out the way that he wanted it to. That seems to be what was actually happening, especially since instead of talking directly to the camera in something that would appear to be very well planned and researched, it sounded like President Trump was getting at least some of this information for the very first time, was trying to process it there live on stage, which is not a good thing to do in most circumstances. It's the reason that I prefer to have a little bit of prep ahead of time instead of just spitballing when I get in front of the camera every day. And so that's where I think President Trump made his big mistake. I think that he worded something improperly, and he wasn't actually trying to be sarcastic. It just came out wrong, and that was the closest defense that he could think of. Not really a smart way to handle it. However, what I do think is even more ridiculous, because somehow, no matter what President Trump does, he seems to have the ability to make his opponents do something even dumber. In response to this very bad defense, CNN did a fact check. Not a rebuttal, not an opinion piece, an actual fact check. You can actually see this right here where CNN actually had a fact check on whether or not President Trump was lying or not when he said it was sarcastic. Now, here's the thing. CNN, the information in that article, because I read it, beginning to end, the information in it isn't unfair. It isn't bad. They're basically making the case that all of the circumstances surrounding it, that President Trump wasn't really being sarcastic. If you put the content of that article and just took out the stuff that's saying that this is a fact, it's actually not a bad opinion piece. And it pretty convincingly makes the case that President Trump was not being sarcastic, which is a case that I actually just laid out. But even if I agree with CNN's conclusion, and I do, which is rare for me, what they did wrong is that they added the label of a fact check. You can't do that when you're trying to be a serious journalistic organization. That's not the way this works, because you can't say definitively that you know for a fact that President Trump was not thinking, oh, I'll tell a joke here. I don't think that's what's going on. It doesn't appear to me what was going on, and I think I make a pretty good case for explaining why I don't think he was being sarcastic, as I just did. But I can't say definitively, because I wasn't inside Trump's head at the time when that was going on, that I know absolutely he was lying about that, and it absolutely was not sarcasm. I don't think it was. But the fact that CNN tries to paint itself as this organization that always puts facts first, and then they put the moniker of a fact check on something that they have absolutely no way of knowing whether or not it is true or not, it just shows that they play really fast and loose with the definition of the word fact. And fact basically means anything that hurts people with whom we politically disagree. Now, to put into context, to give some perspective maybe, on really where I think the stupidity of not only this whole episode with Trump and the media, but also the American people, and how much we fought over this stupid thing all weekend, and somehow this became the hottest story of the weekend, which is dumb on a number of levels. The Babylon Bee did a really good job with their satire of pointing out why this is so ridiculous. So you'll see this headline that they put together. Headline, Trump says to drink lots of water. Media reports he told everyone to drown themselves. So the Babylon Bee really doing the Lord's work here. This is one of the better articles they've ever done. It's not their best. It's not the top. It's not as good as Elizabeth Warren coming back and reporting that she did not take the land back from the Palefaces to the Indian tribe after she lost the election. That was gold. But this is a really good article. So that's the headline. And it says, at the press conference last night, President Trump told everyone to stay hydrated and drink lots of water. Quote, water's tremendous, very powerful stuff, he said. You won't believe the things that they can do with water. Water balloons, water slides, water beds. It's amazing. You can freeze it and you can make ice, I'm told. Great. Ice is great for lots of things. Ice cream, ice cubes, igloos. Anyway, drink water. Horrified journalists scrambled to warn Americans not to drown themselves in pools of bathtubs. Trump says water is good, but this is very misleading, said Rachel Maddow. Did you know that water kills many people every year? These dangerous, unhinged remarks from the president could cause many to drown themselves. Plus, do you know what's hidden in water? Sharks. This president wants you to die from a shark attack. Representatives from various bottled water companies quickly released a statement distancing themselves from the president's remarks and warning everybody not to submerge themselves in the ocean for several minutes at a time. Oh, the Babylon Bee. Gotta love it. But I mean, that's really what this all comes down to, isn't it? The media thinks that you're an idiot, And they think that you're so stupid that you're not smart enough to understand that when the president was saying that, he wasn't saying inject Lysol directly into your bloodstream. They really think you're that dumb. And we kind of saw this beforehand with people, with the media blaming President Trump for people drinking fish tank cleaner, which wasn't even the same drug. It just had a name that kind of sounded similar to it. And somehow that's President Trump's fault. They really think an average reasonable person could see that and think, oh, maybe I should go and drink some fish tank cleaner. Or that the average person, or at the very least the average Trump voter, is so dumb that they would see this and go, I'll just start injecting Clorox directly into my bloodstream. No, nobody's that stupid. And if they are, maybe we should let, natural selection take its place at this point. But nonetheless, the media really does assume that the average person is a moron, and that's what's really going on here. That, and they want to score political points. That's really the main goal after all this. But if you want to know the real reason, and this is why you come to us for the real news that other people aren't going to bring you. If you want to know the real reason that President Trump may have suggested that you need to inject yourself directly with a chemical cleaning agent, well, here's your answer right here. I mean, do you need a better reason? That's it right there. Trump is playing 8D underwater chess with Kim Jong-un, and he's the reason. That's how you take down a terrorist without firing a single shot. I really do think the dumbest part of this whole thing, though, is that we made such a big deal over it. Look, it was a dumb moment for the president, and that's really all the attention that it deserved. For us to chuckle at it for a second and go, that didn't turn out exactly the way he planned it, and then move on with our lives. And the fact that overshadowed a lot of really interesting information, stuff that's really good and helps us to understand that this thing probably is going to be seasonal, and going outside is actually something that would really be beneficial for us and very safe for us, and we could really start getting to the place to where we're somewhat resuming our lives, because sunlight and humidity tend to kill this thing. All that got overshadowed by the fact that President Trump made a word salad and everybody was trying to interpret it. It just shows that we're wasting our time in a lot of ways. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's Chaplain's Report, we are continuing our series in the book of Samuel, and you may recall from the last Chaplain's Report that when we last left this little episode between Samuel and the children of Israel, they were begging him for a king. They didn't want judges anymore. They didn't like God's system. They didn't like the system that he had set up and that Moses had set up. And so they decide, you know what, let's just have a king like every other country. That's what we really want. And they specifically cite Samuel's sons, which they had a legitimate gripe with. I mean, it wasn't as though the sons were doing their job and doing what they were supposed to, so this is not completely without merit. But they had a legitimate complaint with Samuel's sons, and so what they decided to do is say, hey, look, we can't do this anymore. Let's just go ahead, have a king like every other country, be just like them, and everything will be fine. And they keep calling for this, and so that's really where we pick up where we are here in Samuel in 1 Samuel 8, verses 7 through 8, where it says, "The Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Take all the deeds which they have done since the day that I have brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing also." I think one of the things that this verse illustrates is the reason why human beings should not have anywhere near this kind of power over another individual. The reason really goes back to human beings just can't be trusted with it. No human being should be king over another human being, because a king essentially replaces God. Once someone has a king, then in many ways, and I'm not saying that every single person that lives in a monarchy is doomed to not have God as king over their life, but it makes it harder. That's the issue. You see, with a person that is able to freely make their own decisions, that is able to operate with a great degree of autonomy, then they have choice over who gets to be king over their life. Now, granted, most people do not choose God. They choose either some kind of material thing or another person. But the point is, the reason that God didn't want Israel to have a king is because he wanted to be their king. He wanted to set up a system, and he wanted them to know and them to be able to see, no, I am your king. And I have judges that are tasked with enforcing my law and doing what I tell them to do, but ultimately, they serve me. I'm the king, and they're the ones that are charged with seeing that what I have told them to do gets carried out. That's why Israel was a theocracy. Now, it was still a theocracy after the king took place, but think about how many kings believed that it was within their power and authority to go above what God had commanded them to do and do evil. And one thing that is a common phrase that is repeated over and over again through the scripture is, so-and-so was king, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Usually it provides a couple of details, and then the scripture usually follows that up with, and he caused Israel to sin. See, there were some really bad people, there were bad judges, there were bad priests, but they didn't have the level of power and authority over a person's life that a king did. And they had to be put in place because they had to have some kind of structure and some kind of government hierarchy. But ultimately, when it came to the day-to-day operations and how a person lived, a king just has so much more power over somebody than a judge, especially because he's the only king and there's not several judges or several people that can carry this out. It is a very fertile breeding ground for sin and corruption. And such individuals have the absolute power and authority over other people's lives to cause them to, or at least make it significantly harder for them to live a godly lifestyle. Priests and judges can do that too, but not nearly to the level that a king can. And this is the reason that God did not want them there. He wanted himself to be the king of our life. He deserves to be in that position. And it reminds me of something that Jesus said in John 15:20, where he said, "Remember that a servant is not greater than his master." And the reason that he was making that point is that he said, look, the way that they are persecuting me, they're going to do the same thing to you. Be aware of that. Remember that when all of this is going on, that when I'm out of here, they're going to persecute you too. And this is part of the reason that God says to Samuel, look, they haven't rejected you alone. What they've really done is they've rejected me. Because for all of Samuel's flaws, he did do what God asked him to do. He was God's emissary. He was his mouthpiece. He was doing his job. And the people rejected him anyway. They weren't really rejecting him. They were rejecting God. Now, if Samuel had not been doing what God told him to do, then this episode plays out very differently. Then all of a sudden they are rejecting Samuel. They're saying that Samuel's not the right man for the job, that he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, but in this circumstance, God is making it very, very clear that what is actually going on here is that they've rejected him. And to us as modern-day Christians, this is something that is a goal we actually should aspire to, not getting rejected, because, even though that's going to happen, it's not something that we're working towards. But what I'm talking about is the people that are going to reject us. If we're living the way that we're supposed to, if we're sharing the gospel the way that we're supposed to, then when they do reject us, they're not really rejecting us, they're rejecting God. A lot of people are going to do that. The majority of people are actually going to do that. The vast majority of people are not going to be saved, are going to reject the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's something that is guaranteed by the scriptures. However, we need to make sure that if they do that, that they're rejecting God, that we put ourselves in a right relationship with God the way Samuel did, so that if they do choose to not listen to our message, that they're not rejecting us, they're rejecting God. Then that's their problem. Then it's not us. At that point, we've done everything that we can, just like Samuel had in this situation. And you'll also notice that the reason that God explains this and the way that he does sort of illustrate it to Samuel so that he can better understand it is to remind them of Israel's history. Because Samuel's really upset about this. He's depressed. We saw that in our last reading. The thing displeased Samuel. Samuel's really upset about this, and God's reminding him, he's like, look, they've rejected me since the beginning. I brought them out of Egypt. First thing they did, build an idol. And then they were wandering around, and I was leading them through Israel to retake it. First thing they did, get into idolatry. This is a thing that continues to go on until this day in Israel. They've always done this. They've always rejected God, both as their God and their king. And God is saying, Samuel, there's nothing you could have done to change this. This is who they are. And it's something that is depressing, and it's a reality that we as Christians don't usually want to deal with, but sometimes we have to remember, and I don't think we need to adopt the attitude that, oh, well, if they reject us, that's just their problem, and there's nothing that I can do. No, there are some things that we need to do. There's a lot that we need to do to make sure we're in the same position as Samuel, to where we're doing everything we can. And if they reject us, then they're just rejecting God, and that's on them, not us. But ultimately, we need to remember that the average person is going to do that. Just like Samuel needed to be reminded by God here, he's like, look, Samuel, this is who they are. They constantly reject me. And so if they reject us, then that's not something they haven't already done to Jesus Christ. The one perfect human that ever walked this earth was murdered for crimes he didn't commit. Do you really think that they're going to give us a fair hearing? Think about it that way. If we're not greater than our master, and that's a concept that God explained here to Samuel, then we have to remember the people are going to reject us, but ultimately they're rejecting the truth. Ultimately, they're rejecting what God has in store for them. And as much as it hurts, as much as it pains us to see people walk away from something that could be so life-changing and so wonderful for them, we have to remember that at a certain point, God hands them over to give them exactly what they ask for. Some people spend their whole lives basically rejecting God and saying to him, no, we want something else to be king, whether it's postmodernism or sex or drugs or whatever else it is. We want something else to be our king. At a certain point, God is going to say, all right, have at it. You want to make money your king? Go ahead, follow it. And the horrible things that happen afterward, which God warns them about here in the next verse, all those things are going to come true, not because God's directly punishing them or God's just kind of smiting them for rejecting him, but because that's just the way that it happens. When you follow anything other than God, when you make anything other than God the center of your life is not going to turn out very well. And the children of Israel are about to get a lesson in that firsthand. When you put anything other than God on the throne in your life, those results aren't good. No human being has the ability or the capacity, not even one as good as David, has the ability to replace God. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media, Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.